Hello class, Professor Bloom here. As we have previously discussed, there are three sources of knowledge in kinesiology. In the first part of our course, we focused on physical activity experience. Now we're going to learn about the scholarship of physical activity. And to do this, we will explore the 7 most important sub-disciplines of kinesiology, which are philosophy, history, sociology, motor behavior, sport and exercise, biomechanics, and physiology of physical activity. As we explore these subdisciplines, we will only scratch the surface and introduce ourselves to their body of knowledge. However, your future studies in upper division coursework and graduate school will likely explore these subdisciplines in further depth. The first subdiscipline we are going to learn about is philosophy of physical activity. Our objectives for this chapter is to examine the nature of philosophical thinking, to describe the goals of philosophy of physical activity, to describe how philosophy fits into the field of kinesiology, to describe research methods used in the philosophy of physical activity, and to provide an overview of knowledge in this domain by focusing on 3 issues: the nature of the person, the nature and value of play, and the ethics of sport. You will not be tested on the history of philosophy of physical activity. The goals of philosophy of physical activity are to understand the nature of health and physical activity, particularly in the forms of exercise, sport, games, play, and dance. To understand our level of confidence in our claims in kinesiology, to understand the most important values of physical activity as well as its contribution to good living, and to learn how we ought to behave in sport and in our professional lives as kinesiologists. Why use philosophical thinking? Philosophy means love of wisdom. Philosophy is often referred to as the queen of the sciences. Philosophy provides us with observation and critical evaluation of physical activity in the real-world setting. Philosophers use reflective techniques to answer questions that cannot be fully addressed through testing or measurement or other experimental methodologies that other disciplines might use. Valid and reliable results are expected, even without controlled experiments, as in the physical sciences. Philosophy of physical activity involves reflecting on the nature and value of both tangible and intangible objects. There are 4 different types of reflection used. Personal opinion, which are the lowest level of truth claim, because personal opinions may be true for one person, but not necessarily others. Speculation, which is the forming of a theory or conjecture without firm evidence. Probable assertion, a claim around which evidence such as personal experience, logic, insights, or objective observations can be gathered. And truth assertion, claims that are very difficult to question. There is movement towards a more holistic approach to kinesiology, which encourages cross-disciplinary research, professional practice, and performance. Subdisciplines should be working together and are interdependent rather than independent. Interaction between the spheres is a 2-way, suggesting theory informs practice, and conversely, practice informs theory. Philosophy's goal is to better understand the world and our lives in it. In kinesiology, that means to better understand human movement, or as it's identified in this text, physical activity. Philosophic thinking is needed in order to address a number of issues that are important for kinesiologists. To explore questions like, what is the scope of our field? To do that, we would need some understanding of metaphysics, which is the branch of philosophy which distinguishes one thing from another, reality, the what is question. To explore questions like, how confident are we in our findings, we would need some understanding of epistemology, which is the branch of philosophy which examines how we know things and with what assurances we can claim something is true. The how do we know questions. To explore questions like what really matters in kinesiology, we would need some understanding of axiology, which is the branch of philosophy that examines the value of things, the what is important questions. And to explore questions like how should we behave as kinesiologists, we would need some understanding of ethics, which is the branch of philosophy that examines how we should behave, the should questions. Philosophers try to answer questions by reflecting on experience, using logic, and trying our conclusions in everyday life to see how they work. We are going to focus on 3 reflective reasoning processes that philosophers of physical activity use. Inductive reasoning begins with specific cases to develop broad, general principles. Deductive reasoning begins with broad factual or hypothetical premises in order to determine more specific conclusions that follow from them. And descriptive reasoning begins with one example of some phenomenon and then varies it to see how dramatically it changes. Phenomenology. Change or its absence allows a more accurate description of the central characteristics of the item being examined. Inductive reasoning begins with specific cases and develops broad conclusions. Deductive reasoning begins with broad premises and determines specific conclusions. And descriptive reasoning begins with one example and varies it to see how dramatically the phenomenon changes. We need to know the person before we can understand why he or she participates in physical activity. Understanding the human part of human movement. To understand who our clients are and what a person is. We're going to examine the nature of the person, specifically the mind and body relationship, the nature of sport and competition and their relationships to work and play, values promoted by physical activity, and ethical values and sport. How we deal with people, examples to cure them, to educate them, or to teach them, is affected by what we think a person is. If we carry false impressions of human nature, we risk using inappropriate, ineffectual, or dangerous interventions. To explain what human beings are, and specifically the mind-body relationship, we will study 3 different positions of philosophers. Materialism. The human being is nothing more than a complex machine, and subjective experiences are real but have no power. Dualism. The mind and body are separate. Our thoughts count, priorities given to the mind. Note that many physical educators and exercise scientists are dualists because they believe that consciousness is real and that non-physical ideas impact motor behavior. And holism. The mind and body are interdependent. All behavior is ambiguous. The mind and body work together. It's often referred to as body-mind. Sport is very popular throughout the world. Sport's popularity presents us with a philosophical question. What accounts for the allure of competition, play, and games? Where does its value reside? And why do so many people like it? Here's some of the reasons that we explore in philosophy. Sport is grounded in artificial problems. Built-in inefficiencies create challenges, unlike most of life. Sport is a game in which motor skills are required to reach its goal. Sport and the creation of excellence and meaning. Many sport skills would be meaningless in ordinary life. Motor skills represent the standards of excellence by which players evaluate their performance. Sport and fair competition. The process of competing in the game is valued as much as the outcomes that result from the play. One way we experience sport is as play. Play is the manner in which we approach and embrace and experience the activity itself. Sport requires autotelic attitude. This distinction means that while at play, we are interested not in any payoff that might come from participating in an activity, which is the extrinsic benefit, but rather the activity itself. Intrinsic benefit. Sport as beneficial duty is when the focus is placed on external rewards. Extrinsic, like good health, teaching civil and moral values, fostering national pride, combating sedentary living and obesity. When we combine sport that is play and has good competition, it becomes even more meaningful. Values are our conceptions of the importance of things that we use to make decisions, both in personal and in professional matters. Our moral values refer to our character and how we ought to behave. Non-moral values refer to objects of desire, such as happiness, ice cream cones, good health. There are several values associated with physical activity. We are going to focus on 4. Health-related physical fitness, knowledge about the human body, physical activity, and health practices, motor skill, and activity related to pleasure or fun. Each of these values, fitness, knowledge, skill, and pleasure, would support a different approach to participating in and developing physical activity programs if you use them as the central guide or priority for planning and intervention. These 4 values are not mutually exclusive. All of them influence each other. And as professionals, we must rank which are important to our goals and prioritize them. You might think about in what order you rank the 4 values that we just cited in the previous slide: fitness, knowledge, skill, and pleasure, in your own physical activity experiences. What ethical obligations do sports people have? They should ask what is right and wrong and what ought and ought not to be done. It helps us to answer the question, how should we behave? We need to formulate defensible standards of behavior. We want to be impartial, consistent, and critical. We need to follow a universal moral point of view. No one should count more than anyone else, players, fans, coaches, etc. And rule bending and intentional harm are not justifiable. The access code for our quiz is SPORT, S-P-O-R-T, SPORT. Our basic behavioral guidelines for sport are to follow the rules of the sport, respect your opponent, strive to bring out the best performance in one another, care about your opponent's well-being as much as yours, and how you play says as much about you as a scoreboard does. In this chapter, we have learned that philosophy offers us knowledge and a way of thinking. Make sure you take